Hey, Kurt.
How's it going, Aaron?
Good. Hey,
Nice to see you again.
thank you. Yeah, you too. So previously on A Problematic Voice, you had made mention of talking about where the system of how we do church comes from. You said we'll cover that later.
Sure.
It's later.
Do you want to cover that now?
Yeah. So, well, you made kind of vague reference to it. Catch us up a little bit. The kind of conventional building-based system of church.
Sure.
What can you tell us?
Sure. And I think I was speaking in my own story when I was preparing for ministry. I thought I was going to be a church planter. During that time of preparation, I was studying the early church, the New Testament church, trying to learn all I could so that we could have the kind of effectiveness that they had. That was my heart's desire. But I was viewing it all through the lens of, traditional, conventional church and that system. The idea that the system that has the things we've been talking about, the professional clergy, the buildings, the programs, the parking lots, all of that. And I didn't realize at the time that that's not the system that the New Testament church was employing. It's not what they did, And when we stop and think about it, there's nobody building a building to house their people or to have their gatherings in anywhere in the New Testament. We don't see a single person with the title of pastor. We see, of course, leadership. We see.
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you every once in a while.
Go right ahead.
I
Absolutely.
hope that's okay.
That way
we don't see
forget
people with the title of
pastor.
And yet we. Again, I need to. My skeptical mind just goes, but wait. But Jesus told Peter to shepherd people, and if the word pastor means shepherd, then, and you had made mention of Ephesians and the fivefold ministry, and one of those gifts to the church being pastors. So before I just let you continue forward.
Right. Give me a little pushback.
Yeah. So, but it does talk about pastor. So when you say we don't see the title of pastor being used in the New Testament, what do you mean?
Sure. What I mean by that is that we don't see a single person with that title. Like, you don't say, nobody called Peter Pastor Peter. Nobody called Paul Pastor Paul. What we tend to see in the New Testament is that those fivefold ministry gifts of apostle, prophet, evangelist, and I'm going to say shepherd and teacher, because the shepherd is the word that's used there in the Greek. The same word that is translated shepherd 18 times in the New Testament, it's only translated pastor that one time. If the New Testament translators were translating, doing a direct translation from the Greek, the word pastor wouldn't exist in the New Testament at all. But it's there because now I think it's there, it seems like, because the pastoral role, the position, the job, title was already in existence before people, the modern translations were made. And so they put the word pastor in sort of like to justify what they're already doing. But what we see in the New Testament is that, for example, in Acts 13, it talks about the leadership of the church at Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were sent from. And it says that there were 5 leaders. I think that's interesting because there were 5 leadership gifts. Now, I can't say for sure that one was an apostle and one was a prophet. The scripture also says that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And it says it is built, not it was built. It's present tense. So to build the church, we still need people with the apostolic and prophetic gifts, as well as the gift of evangelism and the gift of shepherding and the gift of teaching. So you're absolutely correct that shepherding is a part of maturing the flock, But what we've done in our system is we've taken that shepherding role and we've elevated it to an exclusive kind of a position at the expense of the other roles. People who have the gift of evangelist and apostle and prophet, oftentimes those people don't even go to church because they don't feel like they fit there. They don't feel like they belong there because the system isn't really designed for them to function in their gifts, because we've elevated this pastor position above the other leadership positions.
If we were to use the terminology that you used earlier, what did you say, the business of religion? When we say pastor in our context, we kind of mean CEO.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a lead pastor, a chief executive officer.
Right.
Okay, and you're saying, I mean, that's. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. You're saying we don't see that kind of a CEO position in the church.
Yeah, with an office, an actual, building with a little room where they sit in there and prepare their sermons. Sermons are typically more spontaneous in the New Testament. Preaching in the New Testament is done to the lost. It's not done to the found. A lot of people use that terminology when they talk about, that pastor is such a good preacher, but they're really talking about the teaching he's doing to people who are already saved. So really, you touch on a good point. There are many people who have the title of pastor, the position, the salary, but they don't have the gift. Where God has maybe gifted them in teaching, maybe he's gifted them in administration, so they can kind of CEO this business, this religious business, but they don't have this gift of shepherding the sheep. And, in our last segment, we talked about helping people learn how to learn from God. And if you think about how does a sheep eat, or who feeds a sheep? How does a shepherd feed a sheep? They don't chew up the grass for them and then spit it out into little bowls and spoon feed it to them, do they? They just put the sheep in the green grass and the sheep feed themselves. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, let's get past this place where, and I talk to a lot of pastors who, and maybe you feel this way, you're a pastor, who say that they feel like a babysitter. In a lot of ways, they can't figure out why the people don't seem to mature, even though they're hitting them with good biblical truth week after week after week. The people just tend to sort of stay at this level of spiritual infancy. And part of the reason is because we're spoon feeding them. In my mind, I picture congregations full of people in high chairs with their,
I can tell you that I react strongly against I've heard it many times in the 13, 14 years that I've been pastoring. I'm looking for a place that I can get fed.
Yeah.
So I get what you're saying. I brought you off track a little bit because you were talking about where did our systems come from. So
sure.
We're contrasting our current leadership structure with the New Testament leadership structure. But let's get back to how do we get here? Where did it come from?
Sure. Now this is difficult for some people to really wrap their brain around. Sometimes, it's downright upsetting to people when they learn this reality. I travel around the world and train pastors, and I have seen them run the gamut from tears to anger. Some are. One man in India said, "I've been 60 years. I've been working as a minister for God. He was 20 something, and he's about 80 years old, and he was just mad because he said, I spent 60 years thinking I'm supposed to be advancing this system that doesn't even have its origin in the New Testament."
Okay.
Just made him mad.
So if you make me cry, that's going to be remarkable.
Well,
I appreciate the setup. I appreciate the warning.
Yeah,
I'm going to try to hold it back.
I'll try not to make you cry. So
or angry. So, but
yeah. Well, don't hit me.
Right.
But no, the truth is that that in the New Testament times, the church was persecuted, so they met in secret. They met in hiding. They did meet in the temple, and people say, "Oh, look, the temple. They met in a building." Well, that's true, but they didn't build that building, and they didn't own that building, and they didn't operate that building. And in fact, they were in danger in that building. They would get arrested there. They would get persecuted there. They were the minority coming into that building and saying things like, "You killed the author of life, you people who run this building." They were not welcome there. So this was a public forum. So they were meeting in public and from house to house. Paul uses those words in, I believe it's Acts 2:20. He says that I shared the gospel publicly and from house to house. So that's the two things we see: public, house to house. You don't see sanctuary space, where the safe place where the Christians can gather. A bird sanctuary is a safe place for birds, and a wildlife sanctuary is a safe place for wildlife. At a church sanctuary, the idea that we have a safe place to go gather, it's not found in the New Testament. You just don't see anybody doing that anywhere. You don't see anybody meeting in the same place 2 weeks in a row. Same place, same time. You know what I mean? We can infer, we can guess, we can maybe say, well, maybe the people of Antioch did or didn't. So this is a broad oversimplification. So for those of you who are listening, I realize that there are a lot of things going on in the world in the formation of the church. But in a broad generalization, the church started in Jerusalem as simply followers of Jesus who made more followers of Jesus, obedient, reproducing disciples. And then 300 years later, it got to Rome before then, but about 300 years later, we have the Emperor Constantine. And Constantine claims to have become a Christian, claims to have come to Christ. There's debate over whether he was truly born again. He didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed, which is kind of odd if he came to Christ, many years earlier. But Constantine wanted to create this religion of Christianity. And so, but remember, before him, primarily the church is being persecuted. So they're meeting in secret. They're small groups in homes. They're trying not to be found. They're trying not to be obvious. So he doesn't have an obvious example of what to follow as he develops his religion. I ask people, if the president of the United States were to, especially the one we have today, if he were to want to invent a religion, because he's probably the most powerful man on earth. At the time, Constantine was probably the most powerful man on earth. If he was going to invent a religion, would it just be sort of a halfway, kind of a ho-hum religion? Would he just kind of do a mediocre job of creating that religion, or would he go all out and create the best religion the world's ever seen?
Well, I know the answer that you want me to say.
Mm-hmm.
There are probably a lot of podcasts that we could do theorizing about
Sure.
about that. But I imagine somebody who has a solid gold restroom would go all out.
Yes. And so that tends to be the consensus as I ask that question around the world. So Constantine was a guy like that who, I'm the emperor. I think I'm the greatest man on earth. So he's going to create a religion. He's going to call it Christianity, but he can't look at any examples of the actual followers of Christ because they're, trying to be in hiding and in secret. So he looked around at the pagan religions of Rome. He looked around at, well, how are these guys doing religion? And we'll just do it like them because it's the only example he had. So we can fault him a lot or we can fault him a little. But he said, well, they've got buildings, so we're going to have buildings. And so they took some of the pagan temples and they just renamed them as Christian temples. And then they said, well, they've got a guy in there called the priest, the pagan priest, so we'll have to have priests. And so they started, every building has to have the priest that runs the religion in that building. They had altars. And on the altar was the sacrifice, usually an animal sacrifice. So he said, well, we'll have an altar and we'll put our sacrifice on it. And that's where the Eucharist comes from. We'll put Jesus on the altar every week. body and blood of Christ every week. And, they had schools to teach their priests how to run their religion. So he said, well, we'll have schools to teach our priests how to run our religion. And that's where we get our Bible schools and our seminaries from. You don't see any Bible schools or seminaries in the New Testament, but it comes from, this copying pagan religion, and right down to the priests wear special clothes so you can tell that they're the religious professionals. All of this stuff comes from copying the pagan religion of Rome in the time of Constantine, and it does not come from the New Testament model, the practices of the New Testament church. And so when people realize that, especially, the more highly a person is invested in that system, the harder that is to realize, the more difficult.
And part of what I hear you describing is not just the pagan religions of that day, but when you talk about there's a temple, there's a priest, there's sacrifices, an altar, there's special clothing for the priest. I mean, all that is Old Testament as well. That's Judaism as well.
Sure.
So yeah, it is interesting to think. Yeah, why would the New Testament followers of Jesus just kind of recreate what Jesus had already fulfilled, and yet we just continue that.
Right. When Jesus said it is finished on the cross, I think that might be one of the things he was referring to.
Okay.
The old covenant, is finished.
So you're saying what we call traditional or conventional church today, what we know as our way of doing things, is looks more like what Constantine instituted.
It's a copy of the pagan religions of Rome, and that's what it looks like. That's where the Catholic Church comes from. That's how it got its, start. And then from there, it spread, of course. The Catholic Church has tried to spread itself around the world, and it spread to Europe. And then in Europe, it became institutionalized. So some people say, when it started in Jerusalem, it was a kingdom. The kingdom of Jesus is expanding around the world. It wasn't a religion. I don't think Jesus ever said, I came to start Christianity. It was a foreign concept to his followers in the New Testament. But then, got to Rome, got turned into a religion, got to Europe, got turned into an institution, and then the Europeans brought it to America. And as we do with everything in America, we turned it into a business. We're highly motivated by the bottom line. And, we monetize the thing. How do we make this thing something where, it can be financially viable? And then we exported it to the world and told the rest of the world, this is how you do it. But it's not at all how it was done in the beginning.
Yeah, interesting. Well, and part of my challenge in planting a church is thinking about how to organize for effectiveness. We want to be effective. We're not just doing this to spin our wheels. We want to see the kingdom of God expand. And what I learned about organizing for effectiveness really does look a lot like how businesses are organized. It just does.
Sure.
I'm not necessarily going to go undo all of that if it continues to be effective. But yeah, if we're honest about it, we can put some names and some labels on some of these things. Essentially, though, we've got a board and we've got a staff, and
sure,
and that's the way a lot of businesses operate.
Yeah, and it is a tradition in the sense that there are many traditions. So I don't think that traditions are in and of themselves bad. People ask me, again, so this thing, because in our last session we said, we don't necessarily want to just throw away and just do away with the building-based, pastor-centered, program-oriented church system, but we want to help it develop into what God wants it to be. Even though it doesn't have its origin in the New Testament, it doesn't necessarily mean we should just bulldoze the whole thing. It means that we should take steps to make it effective. I'm thinking of Jesus' words in Matthew 15, verse 3. And he said, "Why do you disregard the commands of God for the sake of your traditions?" And I think if he came into our churches today, I think he would ask us the same question, into our, building-based churches. Because, in that system, there's three things that are required of people, typically. And if I was doing a training, I would ask, what are the three things, the big three that you want from your congregation, from your members? And usually the very first thing they say is, well, Sunday morning church attendance. That's key. That's got to be there. And then, of course, we want them to tithe or at least give a portion of their income to our ministry, to the local church. People use that terminology. And then they want them to volunteer somewhere, some way, to, lead worship, teach Sunday school, print the bulletins, weed the flower beds, do something so that you're physically, involved. Your time during the week is involved in this place, this system.
Time, talents, treasures. Yeah.
There you go. Well, and it's a little disheartening when people realize that those are the three things that are required by every religion in the world. If you're a Muslim, they want you to come to their meetings, give some money and volunteer somehow. If you're a Hindu, they want you to come to the meetings, come to temple, give some of your money and volunteer somehow. If you're a Buddhist, come to the meetings, give some money and volunteer somehow.
Kurt, I just heard something on the radio, a documentary being made about the Church of Satan in America. And
the same three
people talking about going to a meeting of the Church of Satan and describing it, and the person doing the interview who's not involved in religion said, well, that sounds a lot like church. And they said, yeah, it is a lot like church.
Yeah, who are you worshiping?
Oh no.
Right. So see, none of those things, go to a Sunday morning service, give a percentage of your income to that institution, or volunteer in their programs, are found among the commands of Jesus Christ. So Jesus, I think, would stand and look around at what we're doing and say, why are you ignoring my commands in favor of your traditions? In other words, we're making our traditions of go to church and give money and volunteer more important than obeying the commands of Jesus. And oftentimes I'll say that, and people say, no, that can't be true in my church. That can't be true in my system. And I'll say, well, okay, how do you know if your members are loving their enemies? Because Jesus said, love your enemies. Jesus said, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. Jesus said, do not resist an evil person. Jesus said, go preach the gospel to the whole world. Yeah. Do we have any systems in place to make sure that our members are actually obeying Jesus? Or are our systems set up just to make sure they're obeying our traditions?
It would be fascinating and perhaps horrifying to take an inventory of what churchgoers are saying on social media and putting that side by side with the commands of Jesus about how we're to interact with our world, with lost people, with family, with other people, within the church. Yikes.
Yeah. Wow. On the break, I was thinking about Colossians. We're probably about out of time, but Colossians 4, 5, and 6. Jesus said that you should, or Paul said, Jesus is Holy Spirit speaking through Paul said that we should make the most of every opportunity as we interact with lost people in the way we act and the way we speak. And now we speak through our fingers a lot. We text and we, tweet and message, and the way that we present ourselves to the world, we're supposed to do it in a way that's wise so that we can make the most of every single interaction. And in our social media driven world, we have more opportunities to do that than ever. But are we doing it for the glory of God and for the expanding of the kingdom, or are we doing it for the glory of self?
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is a good point for us to wind things down,
Mm-hmm.
and as we prepare for our next time together, we'll think about that kind of traditional building-based system and explore the New Testament and say, well, what would the New Testament have us do that Jesus would recognize as his ecclesia, as his church? Thank you, Kurt.
Excellent, excellent. And then I want to tell a story about a young girl named Esther next time to make that point.
That sounds great.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Praise the Lord. All right. I've got a disciple maker friend, Samuel Wafula, who always says that. All right.